Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is Britain's oldest serving monarch. In April 1926, however, at the time of her birth, there was no reason to assume she would one day become queen, let alone rule for so long and be so revered. For a portion of her childhood at least, Elizabeth lived the life of a princess without the scrutiny that would normally attend the upbringing of a future sovereign. But what was that childhood like? And how did life change once destiny intervened and her fate as future queen looked to be sealed?
Suddenly to be catapulted into Buckingham Palace, which hadn't had any children living there for ages. And I remember Princess Margaret telling me, she said, of course the first thing I thought was, oh, Lilibet's going to be queen.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born in the early hours of the 21st of April 1926. Her parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, had married 3 years earlier. Elizabeth's father, Bertie, was the second son of George V, and her mother, formerly Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was the 9th of 10 children born to the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. The birth of the King's first granddaughter attracted a great deal of public interest.
The Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, wasn't married, and so of course she was basically number 3 at the time she was born, and that's quite close to the throne. And even in some of the publicity attendant on her birth, there is a hint that this might be the heir, so they kept their options open.
As the Duke and Duchess of York attended to their royal duties, the baby princess was left in the care of her nanny.
Ella, or Clara Knight as she was actually, was her name, was one of these sort of sterling nannies, very much in charge of the nursery, and very, very important, because after all the nursery was their world.
When Princess Elizabeth was just 9 months old, her parents set off on a 6-month tour that took them to Australia via Panama, Fiji and New Zealand. The Duke of York had accepted an invitation to open the Commonwealth Parliament in the new Australian capital of Canberra. It was the most exacting royal duty he had as yet undertaken.
Well, the Duke of York had very much wanted to go on that trip to Australia, but of course it was a great ordeal because it involved a number of speeches. He was going to open the first Federal Parliament, or whatever it was, in Canberra, I think. And he had to therefore learn a lot about these countries and also be prepared to speak. And of course, because he had the speech impediment, that was always very difficult.
Princess Elizabeth was left at home, but she was far from forgotten. Instead, the distant princess became a source of fascination for the press and public alike. Wherever the Duke and Duchess travelled in Australia, they were bombarded with questions about their infant daughter and showered with gifts for her.
I think the Duke and Duchess of York returned with a ship full of presents for the baby, as I suppose was inevitable, and great excitement at this unseen child, and I suppose a certain sympathy with the parents, you know, that they were separated from the little one for such a long period of time, because sea travel in those days did take a long time.
From birth, Princess Elizabeth spent a good deal of her time in Scotland, staying either with her royal grandparents at Balmoral or with her maternal grandparents at Glamis Castle. Princess Margaret was born at Glamis in the summer of 1930. The event was marked with a giant bonfire. Four years later, and the little princesses made one of their first recorded appearances together, again in Scotland.
The royal party are greeted by the Marquis of Aberdeen.
The image was that of a happy young family.
And the Duke and Duchess of York were very much liked. I mean, they were popular. They were perhaps not very prominent in those days, but I mean, they were very, very much a family, and I think people liked that. And that is, of course, what the particular skill that the Duchess of York had, was that she created a happy family atmosphere for her husband, which involved, Sunday lunch and a walk in the park and afternoon teas and things like that, which is what, of course, they later brought in the form of a rather sort of domestic family monarchy.
The family's London home was a spacious townhouse on Piccadilly, number 145. It was here that they were tutored by their governess, Marion Crawford, known as Crawfie.
Crawfie was really totally in charge of their education. I think you could say that the Queen Mother didn't regard the education of women as very important. So Crawfie had to struggle along, covering every field, really.
The little princesses lived lives relatively isolated from the world outside royal circles. But although they lacked playmates, like many aristocratic children, they enjoyed the company of their dogs and horses.
There are quite a lot of pictures around of Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret as children. I think that was considered a great propaganda tool, the Happy Families number. And there they were with their wonderful Wendy house and with their dogs and, playing away on the lawn. And I think, it was considered an ideal family.
The Duke and Duchess of York are bringing their little daughters to Olympia to see the royal tournament.
Public interest in the Duke and Duchess of York and the two princesses continued unabated.
The princesses revel in it. Even when young, all the nice girls love a sailor.
I think it was probably understandable that the public interest should centre rather on these two young princesses. There weren't any others around at the time, as far as I remember. And of course they were glamorous figures and nice little girls, well dressed, well turned out, polite, behaved themselves, and I suppose regarded as rather models for children to look up to.
Within the family, Princess Elizabeth was known as a favourite of King George V. In 1935, together with her sister, she featured prominently at the King's Jubilee, a symbol of youth and renewal.
I know he was not an easy father, but then he probably was an easier grandfather because he didn't have the direct responsibility. And I think, I'm sure he would have been very fond of the children and rather proud of them.
At the start of the following year, celebration turned to mourning. King George V died on the 20th of January 1936. The newsreels documented the demise of a much-loved king.
Britain and Empire mourn their beloved king. The shadow of an almost personal grief darkens the houses of the people. At Sandringham a few days ago, His Majesty caught a chill and was confined to his room. But the expected easy recovery did not take place.
Nine days later, Princess Elizabeth was among the mourners at the funeral of the man she called Grandpa England.
George V's funeral was, I suppose, the last real royal funeral in terms rather like Queen Victoria's, where all the royals turned up. It was a terrific display of the troops, the gun carriage, the slow marching. I think it would have made an impression on her. After all, she was 9, wasn't she, I think? So certainly of an age to take it all in.
At St. James's Palace, Garter, King of Arms, comes to proclaim King Edward VIII.
The Prince of Wales was proclaimed king.
The imperial crown of Great Britain, Ireland, and all other His late Majesty's dominions is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Prince Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and constant obedience.
In his first broadcast to the nation, King Edward VIII acknowledged the high regard in which his father was held.
I feel that his death is not only an overwhelming grief to my mother and to us, his children, but that it is at the same time also a personal loss to you all.
Arrivals for the royal tournament. The Duke and Duchess of York, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret Rose.
With Uncle David now king, Princess Elizabeth became second in line to the throne. Interest in the princess increased, but as yet there was no reason to expect she would ever be queen. Instead, life for the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret Rose progressed much as before.
Inside, the little princesses walked between lines of a guard of honor to see the service's own show.
The Queen and Princess Margaret, I think they relied on each other quite a lot. Although Margaret was 4 years younger, they even used to dress alike, which I think is very odd by today's standards. And they played with each other. And when they went out into the park, they weren't allowed to play with other children. And we only know that because of the memories of the governess Marion Crawford.
The garden party this year was a royal reception, but owing to the mourning for the late king, there will be no courts this year. And so when King Edward walked out into the lovely grounds of Buckingham Palace, it was for more than a garden party.
By this time, news was leaking out of the King's association with an American woman, Mrs. Wallis Simpson. Princess Elizabeth's parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, did their utmost to ensure their daughters were shielded from the gossip.
The extraordinary thing about Mrs. Simpson was that really the British public knew nothing about her at all until very, very shortly before the abdication. Society, of course, did know about her, but the man in the street didn't. And then even at the time when things were getting very difficult, the foreign press were talking about the crisis that was looming, but the British press guarded a kind of, they had a bond of silence between them. I mean, the newspaper editors simply didn't report it.
The spectre of the head of the Church of England marrying a divorcee was unconscionable to the Church, State and royal family. Edward, though, was unwilling to forego his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. Belatedly, the Duke of York realised his brother might choose to abdicate.
I think it would be fair to say right up to late November 1936, given that the abdication was on the 10th, 11th of December, however you look at it, he had no idea that the king was actually likely to go. And of course it was an enormous shock to him, because suddenly he was going to be propelled onto the throne, like it or not, with absolutely no preparation, no training, and not at all sure, this is the thing which worried both the Duke and Duchess of York, not at all sure that the British public would like them or even accept them.
King for barely a year, Edward VIII abdicated on the 10th of December 1936, and his reluctant brother ascended to the throne.
And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the King.
Queen Mary made her own appeal to the nation in support of her blameless younger son, his wife and family.
The Queen Mother, in her message to the nation, said, "I commend to you King George VI. I ask you to give him the same full measure of generous loyalty which you gave to my beloved husband. With him I commend my dear daughter-in-law, who will be his queen. I know that you have already taken her children to your hearts."
We feel you will welcome these intimate pictures of our beloved King and Queen, with their children, the Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, and her sister, Princess Margaret Rose. the head of the greatest empire the world has ever seen, is rightly described on state occasions in elaborate terms. By the grace of God, of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India. But above all, His Majesty King George VI and Queen Elizabeth receive our hearty and humble affection because they are true home lovers, in the sense most respected by every man and woman throughout the civilized world. And it is in this role, before the pomp and pageantry that are to come, that we bring them to you now, in the most charming and natural pictures ever taken of our royal family.
Princess Elizabeth was now first in line to the throne, a fact she is said to have absorbed gradually. In an interview years later, Princess Margaret recounted a conversation with her sister. "When our father became king, I said to her, 'Does this mean you're going to be queen?' She replied, 'Yes, I suppose it does.' She didn't mention it again." The new royal family had left Piccadilly and were now installed at Buckingham Palace. It was no longer possible to retain the illusion of being an ordinary family. For Princess Elizabeth, a detective now accompanied her everywhere. She discovered by merely walking in front of a sentry on ceremonial duty, she could make him present arms. And reportedly she no longer referred to Mummy and Papa, but the King and Queen.
Suddenly to be catapulted into Buckingham Palace, which hadn't had any children living there for ages. And I remember Princess Margaret telling me, she said, of course the first thing I thought was, oh, Lilibet's going to be Queen, and asking her. And I thought, well, you know, I'm going to, even then she thought, well, it's rather like losing a sister in some ways, because the minute the Queen, when they moved into Buckingham Palace and she was the heir, she was educated very differently from Princess Margaret.
Only once or twice in the life of each one of us comes such a day as this, when we realize that we're watching history in the making, when we know that generations of Englishmen to come will look back on this day. For May the 12th, 1937, will be one of the dates in English history that the school children will learn, maybe 1,000 years from now. Every moment, the thrill of excitement increases. Early in the day, the vast crowd cheers their Royal Highnesses Princess Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, and then their Royal Highnesses the Duchess of Gloucester and the Duchess of Kent. And always the air is filled with the expectant murmur of what must surely be the largest crowd London has ever known, gathered in its hundreds and thousands and millions on this dull spring morning. And now, with a flashing of breastplates and a clatter of hoofs, the moment has come. With slowness and dignity, the coronation coach moves forward, bringing with it, symbolized in our royal family, all the history and tradition of Britain and the Empire. Never before have such solemn and dramatic pictures appeared on the screen. The ceremony that has remained unchanged for 1,000 years. The procession of Her Majesty the Queen moves up the nave to be greeted after the anthem by the scholars of Westminster School with the Vivat Regina.
At the King's coronation, the young princesses sat with their grandmother, Queen Mary, in the royal box at Westminster Abbey. During the 3-hour ceremony, Princess Elizabeth watched intently as her father and mother were crowned King and Queen. She wrote after the event, "I thought it was all very, very wonderful, and I expect the Abbey did too. The arches and beams at the top were covered in a sort of haze of wonder as Papa was crowned. At least I thought so." But not everything about the ceremony impressed her. At the end, the service got rather boring, as it was all prayers. Granny and I were looking to see how many pages to the end, and we turned one more, and I pointed to the word at the bottom of the page, and it said, "Fini." We both smiled at each other and turned back to the service.
She took it all in very much. I think, I mean, she was much more serious-minded than Princess Margaret, which is probably lucky. I remember Princess Margaret, all she thought about at the coronation was that the Queen was going to wear a sort of golden crown. And Princess Margaret kept on saying, "Where's mine?" And they sort of said, "Well, we're not quite sure whether you're going to wear one. You're a bit small." Anyway, she absolutely insisted, stamped her tiny foot. And as you can see in the photographs, there she is wearing her crown too.
Yet again, press and public interest in Princess Elizabeth intensified. The King and Queen also recognised the importance of equipping their elder daughter for public life. One initiative, encouraged by their governess Crawfey, was the establishment of a girl guide company at Buckingham Palace.
1,000 girl guides attended the national service in St George's Chapel, Windsor. The Princess Royal, president of the Guides, was present with Lady Baden-Powell, chief guide.
I was the patrol leader of the Kingfisher Patrol, and Princess Elizabeth was my second. And I remember thinking what a remarkably helpful and useful person she was to have as number 2 in command of something, because you could absolutely rely on her to do anything that was needed.
As the threat of war grew stronger, so the diplomatic workload of the King and Queen increased. On occasion, the princesses played a supporting role, as when they accompanied their mother for the launch of the liner Queen Elizabeth.
Though accompanied by her 2 daughters, this day our Queen seems strangely alone, lacking for the first time on any big occasion the escort of His Majesty. Grave affairs have kept the King in London. We have great pleasure in presenting to you from the grounds of Buckingham Palace these delightful and informal pictures of our royal family, Their Majesties the King and Queen with their 2 daughters. In the windswept garden of their London home, they are discussing details of Their Majesties' forthcoming voyage across the Atlantic.
The princesses were left at home when the King and Queen travelled to Canada and North America in spring 1939. As the storm clouds gathered over Europe, the trip was seen as an opportunity to strengthen transatlantic ties. The press presented their 6-week separation as an example of the sacrifice the royal couple were prepared to make for the national good.
We take this opportunity of wishing many happy returns to Princess Elizabeth on her birthday, and also wish a safe and happy voyage and a safe and happy return to our popular young King and Queen.
Queen Mother always said of that trip to Canada and the United States just before the war, that was the trip that made us. And I think after the abdication, and people knew this is a rather shy, stuttering sort of king, the American public were completely won over by them, whereas they were all pro the Windsors before that. So from their point of view, it was a huge success. From the princess's point of view, it must have been quite strange, because they hadn't been used to being without their parents for quite so long. So it must have been really quite puzzling for them.
War was declared on the 3rd of September. During the course of the next 6 years, the princesses spent the majority of their time at Windsor, while the King and Queen stayed most often at Buckingham Palace. The evacuation of the monarch's children to Berkshire was a useful tool in the Ministry of Information's propaganda kit, and was the theme for Princess Elizabeth's first broadcast in October 1940.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you, living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy, and at the same time, we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
So many people have forgotten how terrifying it was. I was a child in the war, but we thought that Hitler was going to invade any moment. And as a child, we all admired the Queen and Princess Margaret. You know, they were children, but they didn't leave England. They remained in England. They were sort of beacon of hope, actually. They used to speak to the children of England. And we were tremendously comforted, funnily enough, by their presence.
Throughout the war, the public was variously informed of the fine example set by the princesses, in particular Elizabeth, in support of the war effort.
They used to listen to the war news, and when terrible tragedies happened, like the sinking of the Royal Oak early in the war, they would listen to that, and they were both in tears, and then they would knit things for the soldiers and all that kind of thing.
In 1942, Princess Elizabeth accepted the title Honorary Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, and on her 16th birthday she carried out her first inspection of the Windsor-based regiment. 2 years later, on her 18th birthday, Princess Elizabeth was given her first constitutional role.
Princess Elizabeth, heiress presumptive to the Crown of England. The celebration of her 18th birthday brings forth the sincere good wishes of the peoples of the British Commonwealth of Nations. By the Regency Act of last year, Her Royal Highness has had bestowed on her the important office of Potential Councillor of State. Officially, she reaches her majority, but in the full legal sense, she will not come of age until her 21st birthday. These special newsreel pictures were taken a few days ago.
I think being made a Councillor of State means that you are very close to the King. You are one of the few members of the royal family who are going to be the counsellors to the King. And it might have been honorary, but it was a very important step. It was yet another that this is going to be your future Queen.
No longer a child, Princess Elizabeth wanted to play her part in the war effort. She persuaded her parents to let her join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, or ATS, and in February 1945 was registered as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor.
I think it must have been a great satisfaction and pleasure to her to feel that she could play a small part in this dreadful war, and doing all sorts of things that normally, of course, she wouldn't have expected to be able to do. She was, I think, a transport driver. She drove lorries, and she learned how to take them to pieces and put them together and do the sort of small repairs and things. And I know it was an experience that I'm sure she would have really enjoyed.
Just a few days before the final end of the war, Princess Elizabeth was promoted to Junior Commander. On the 8th of May, 1945, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, announced a cessation to hostilities and victory in Europe.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
This was the British people's finest day. VE Day, the end of the German war. Throughout the country, it exploded with spontaneous rejoicing for a great and wonderful deliverance. War scarred the face of Britain, but nothing ever sapped or changed the character of our people.
Buckingham Palace became the focus for the celebrations.
Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds cheered themselves hoarse. 7 times during VE Day, the royal family appeared on the balcony.
The royal family, the King in his naval and Princess Elizabeth in her ATS uniform, were given a rapturous reception.
Their appearance on the balcony and the celebrations at the end of the war was a sort of tremendous national event, you know, the feeling that we've all been through it together, and a family like our family, we're all celebrating. It's been very hard, but we've done it.
The celebrations continued well into the night. The princesses were eager to join the festivities outside the palace and set out in a small party accompanied by a police officer. In a rare interview 50 years later, the Queen would recall, "I remember we were terrified of being recognised, so I pulled my uniform cap well down over my eyes." A grenadier officer amongst our party of about 16 people said he refused to be seen in the company of another officer improperly dressed, so I had to put my cap on normally.
I think it must have been an amazing experience for both the princesses to be able to just walk down and join a crowd. Nobody even recognizing them at the time, to feel part of this great big mob that was rejoicing and so happy that this horror of the war was over. And an experience that would have been unique, I think, for her and for her sister.
Princess Elizabeth's teenage years had been set against the background of war. Now aged 19, a young adult, an honorary colonel and councillor of state, she was increasingly called upon to undertake solo engagements. There was no longer any doubt she would one day be queen. Her brief experience of normality in the ATS was over, the relative privacy of childhood long gone. What lay ahead was marriage, family, and a life of duty and service to the nation.
I think she grew up in a family that put duty very, very high on the list of attributes which they would like to pass on to their family. And I think it always occurred to her that her own wishes and feelings were secondary to what was the best way to act for people generally.